Okay, so this is a video that I've actually thought about doing for a long time now. But as some of you guys know, things have been a little bit crazy for me here lately. I just had the baby and everything, so. But it's not really much of a secret that I'm a bit of a comic book nerd, and I really like finding spiritual messages and content and stuff in my comic books and in my superhero movies and stuff like that. But I wanted to talk about an issue of Thor today. It's the Mighty Thor issue number the Mighty Thor issue number 303. Came out in January 1981, written by Doug Minch and illustrated by Rick Leonardi and Chick Stone. I don't own the actual Mighty Thor issue number 103, but I've got the Marvel Masterworks, the Mighty Thor volume 20, that has issue 303 in it, and I'll try to show you the cover. So it's interesting that in the early 1950s, there was kind of a debate about the influence that comic books had on America's youth, about whether or not they were negative influences and were encouraging teenagers to engage in all sorts of depravity, I guess, whether or not it was making young people violent, the effects it was having on their mental health and things like that. And there were actually televised debates, right, with psychiatrists and some of the artists and everything, to try to figure out just where comic books belonged in the entertainment world, and whether or not they even had a place, or whether or not we should allow our youngsters to read comic books. But it culminated in what we refer to today as the Comics Code Authority, right, or the CCA, which was instituted in 1954. So what the CCA was, it was a list of rules that comic book writers and artists had to follow in order to have their work published. If they broke any of the rules, if they submitted the issue to the CCC and the CCC said, hey, you're in violation of these rules, they had to go back and they had to revise their story, revise their magazine, or else they were not, they weren't supposed to be able to publish it. And so if you were successful and you didn't meet all the rules, they would give you the little seal that you can see right there, approved by the Comics Code Authority. And some of these rules made sense. They weren't allowed to be graphically violent. They weren't allowed to show lots of blood and gore. They're not allowed to have a bunch of sex and nudity and stuff in it. They're not allowed to use profanity or excessive profanity. They wanted female characters to be modestly dressed, right, without exaggerated proportions. They also were forbidding people to mock or make fun of or make light of a person's religious beliefs. And so for fear that they might be misinterpreted, or what someone might consider a mockery would be different from what the artist considered a mockery, a lot of artists and a lot of writers just avoided religious topics altogether, which is why a lot of stories revolved around like Greek mythology or Norse mythology like Thor, because they figured that the readers, it was very unlikely that any of the readers actually worshipped Thor. And so that meant that it was probably safe to write stories about Thor. But as the years kind of progressed, the things got a little bit more lax. The code wasn't quite as strict. The code's not even in use today. Marvel, DC, Image, Dark Horse, none of these major comic book companies use the Comics Code Authority today. And by 1981, apparently Marvel felt comfortable enough to go ahead and start addressing religious topics. They had a little bit in the past, probably most notably in the Ghost Rider comic books, where Johnny Blaze, I did another video where I talked about Johnny Blaze, right, where he sells his soul to the devil. And Jesus himself actually makes a couple appearances in the Ghost Rider comic books in the mid-1970s, early mid-1970s. But for the most part, they just avoided it altogether to avoid, violating the code or inadvertently insulting or offending anybody. But by the time the Mighty Thor got to issue number 303, I guess they felt safe enough to kind of tackle some of these issues. So just like a brief overview of the story, which overall I enjoyed. I really like the story. I really like the artwork and all that stuff. But the basic overall gist of the story, right? Thor's out on patrol. He sees what he thinks is just like an average mugging taking place on the street below him. He goes down to save this guy from being robbed, only to scare away the attackers and find out that their victim is actually a priest. And so Thor takes the priest back inside his church, realizes that the priest has been stabbed. Thor returns to his mortal identity of Dr. Donald Blake, right, to try to help the priest and nurse the priest back to health. And then the priest kind of confides in Dr. Blake about some of the things he's been going through, right? He's been having kind of a crisis of faith, right? There's a businessman by the name of Angelo Simone who has been trying to bully the priest out of the church to actually close the church so that he can have that property to make one of his business buildings on. So the priest is kind of having this crisis of faith, right? He's been fighting against this Angelo Simone guy for a while. Things don't really seem like they're getting any better, and the priest is just kind of run down. He's kind of at the end of his rope. But of course, Thor sets out to help him, and he goes to hunt this Angelo Simone guy down to get him to back off and leave this priest alone. But we come back later to the priest, to a very interesting scene that I don't imagine would make its way into many Marvel comic books today, where the priest is actually in his office, in his church, with a young woman who is pregnant and is confiding in the priest that she's not sure that she can afford to keep the baby. And so the priest is trying to convince this woman that the baby is worth keeping, right? He's trying to convince her not to have an abortion. But while he's talking to this woman, he hears a commotion in his sanctuary outside his office. Fearing that these gangsters, right, for Angelo Simone has come back, he goes to leave, he goes to check on the situation, but for the woman's safety, he locks her in his office so that if there is anyone there causing trouble, they're not able to get into her. But when he gets into his sanctuary, what he realizes is that these people, these violent men, are not in his sanctuary. They're still outside the church, but they're throwing cocktails through the windows, and they've caught his building on fire. And while he's standing there watching his sanctuary burn down around him, he kind of panics and he runs outside. And when he gets outside, he realizes that he forgot that he locked that poor woman in his office. And he knows that if he doesn't go back in after her, that she's going to burn to death in his office, and it's going to be his fault. But he finds himself too afraid to run back into this burning building. So instead, he kind of drops to his knees on the street in front of his church, and he asks God for a miracle. And while he's praying for this miracle, what he doesn't see is that Thor has actually landed on the roof of his church, and Thor has used his hammer, Mjolnir, to call down rain to try to put out the fire. And it starts raining, and the priest thinks, oh, God sent rain so I can go back inside. So he runs in for the girl, gets into his office, grabs her, and they start running back out. She kind of panics and she faints, and the priest is trying to carry her out of the sanctuary. While he's trying to carry her, the wall that's supporting this giant cross in the sanctuary starts to give way, and the cross starts to fall, and it's going to land on top of them, and it's going to crush them. But Thor kind of jumps in at the last second and catches it and saves their lives. And there's this moment where the priest is down on the ground. He's holding this woman. Thor is holding up the wall. And he's looking at Thor, right, who is currently saving his life. And he realizes that Thor is the one who sent the rain that enabled him to go back inside. And there's this very interesting exchange between the priest and Thor, where the priest looks at Thor and he says, you are a god. But then if you and not him, has my faith been restored only for me to find that it has been misplaced? And then Thor says this: there be many gods worshipped on this earth, Father Koza, throughout this universe. They are given truth by the strength of faith, and thus through belief and prayer, all are made true. All spring from the same universal higher force. Your faith is not misplaced. And then, of course, the priest and the woman make it out of the building alive. The businessman that's been trying to bully the priest out of his property backs off and actually gives him money to help rebuild his church. And the entire congregation and everyone kind of pitches in to help rebuild. But as much as I enjoy this issue, as much as I like the artwork, as much as I like the story and everything, I do have to point out the problem with Thor and the priest's exchange in these couple panels here. Essentially, what Thor is affirming for the priest is that his faith is not misplaced, because his God is real. But he also says that all of these gods are real. And his logic, right, his reasoning is that gods are given strength, or given truth, by the strength of faith, right? That that what this really is an attempt at a supporting argument for universalism. Right, so universalism, right, is this idea that it typically means one of two things: either that in the end all are saved and none are lost, or two, and what I think the story is getting at here, is that all belief systems are all equally true, which frankly is absurd. And there's a couple reasons that we can know that. First of all, we have the law of non-contradiction. Right, the law of non-contradiction says that two contradictory statements cannot both be true in the same time and in the same sense. For instance, my shirt is gray. Right, you see the basic color of my shirt is gray, aside from all this down here. My shirt is gray. If someone else were to try to tell me that the basic color of my shirt here was purple, then we know from the law of non-contradiction that we can't both be right. The shirt is either gray or it's purple. It can't be both. And we can apply this to the different world religions and kind of end with the same, in the same kind of way. So, for instance, Christians say that Jesus was the Son of God, right? That he was God in the flesh. Traditionally, though, Judaism has said that Jesus was not God in the flesh. He was just a great prophet. But both of these statements cannot both be true in the same time and in the same sense. Jesus can't be both not God and God. Jesus can't be just a great moral teacher and nothing else, or the Son of God, God in the flesh. He has to be one or the other. Or, for instance, in traditional the Islam tradition, that says that Jesus wasn't actually crucified, that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. It was just someone that looked like him, which explains why after the crucifixion the disciples were able to see him again later. But we know, right, that Jesus either died on the cross or he didn't. Both of those statements cannot be true at the same time. And so we can kind of go through all the world religions, and we can find things like this where we can point out, in areas where they contradict, both of these things can't be true. Right? So when it comes to the crucifixion, either the Christians are right or the Muslims are right. Or with the identity of Jesus, either the Christians are right or the Jews are right. But they can't both be right. Somebody has to be wrong. But another interesting thing about what Thor says here, right? He says that gods are given truth by the strength of faith, and through belief and prayer, all are made true. But faith and belief by themselves are not enough to make something true. They don't actually have any sort of impact on the real physical world around us. So, for instance, once upon a time, the entire planet believed that the Earth was flat. We now know today that it's an orb, a sphere. But back then, everyone thought that it was flat. And even though everyone thought it was flat, even though everyone believed it was flat, even though everyone acted like it was flat, they behaved like it was flat, right? That was not enough to make the Earth flat. It's always been a sphere. So if you were to go back, if you were taking an exam back then and you said the exam said the Earth is flat, true or false, and you said true, and even if your instructor marked it as the right answer, you're both wrong. Belief itself is not enough to change and make real results in the world around us, right? So just believing in a God or a deity is not enough to make that God or that deity real. It might manifest itself in a real way when you believe it, and you center your life around it, but that does not make that God real. And I know that includes Christianity. But that's why I think that the study of apologetics is so important. There's another part in this issue that I took a little bit of an issue with, right, when the priest is talking to Thor. He says, he's talking to Don Blake. And the priest says, "Perhaps I lost my faith years ago and I'm only now realizing it. One thing is certain, I'm no longer strong enough to run this church." And then Donald says, "Why do you think you're losing your faith?" And the priest responds, "Because I see nothing but evil or apathy all around me in this city. I need proof of something good, something higher and nobler. And once one needs proof, faith is dead." I don't entirely agree with that statement. The faith that the Bible calls us to is not some sort of blind, unreasoning faith that believes with no reason or no proof at all. As a matter of fact, in the New Testament, I can't remember the exact passage right now. There's a part where Paul is discussing Jesus' resurrection from the dead, and Paul himself says that he saw the resurrected Jesus. And if that's not enough for you, if you don't believe him, then there are 500 other people that saw it, and you should go and talk to one of them. Right? So Paul says, if you're having a hard time believing this, there is proof, and you can go find it to find out that it's true. If you don't believe me, there's 500 other people that you can talk to that can try to provide you with proof that Jesus did in fact die and rise from the dead. So proof, evidence, right, reason, these things are not opposed to faith. You can be a man of faith and still be a man of science. You can be a man of faith and still be a man of reason. Faith is not worth less when it's based on proof or evidence. And it's my conviction, right, that all the proof and all the evidence, or that all the evidence points to Christianity being true. But I just wanted to bring that up and talk about it. Universalism, a lot of people like to preach it, a lot of people like to support it, a lot of people like to think that that's the truth. It just simply can't be the truth because of the law of non-contradiction, and there are other things that we could point out as well. It's just simply impossible for every world religion to be true. So really what that leaves us with, right, as a Christian, like I said, I think all the evidence points to say that Christianity is the truth. That means that Jesus is the only truth, the only way for any of us to come to God and enjoy eternal life with him. Salvation can be found nowhere else outside of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. He is the only means to our salvation. So I hope that you guys were able to get some sort of encouragement out of that. I don't know if I actually made any sense the entire time I was talking, but I hope that something here would encourage you, that something here would make you think, and that maybe now you have an answer, something that you can give to someone the next time that they tell you that they think all world religions are equally true. If this is something that you guys liked, maybe we can do something like this again, where I find different comic book stories, right, that have spiritual lessons and stuff like that in them that I can make a video about and we can talk about. They don't always have to be refuting the comic book. Sometimes comic books get it wrong. I think sometimes they get it right. So if you guys are interested in doing something like that, let me know. I know that I recently talked about doing a series where we go through the 5 points of Calvinism, right? Tulip, total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. I do intend on getting started on that soon, but I just wanted to say really quick at the end of this video, before I start posting things like that, I know that some of these doctrines that we're going to go over, when we do that, perseverance of the saints, limited atonement, unconditional election, I know that some of these things are kind of controversial, and I've seen a lot of people kind of split and divide over these topics and these issues before. But I just wanted to say that that's completely unnecessary. Right, in the Christian faith, there are cardinal doctrines, right, things that we're not allowed to disagree on, but there are also non-cardinal doctrines, things that we are allowed to disagree on, right? So a cardinal doctrine would be like Jesus' divinity or his resurrection from the dead, right? We cannot disagree on those things, because to disagree on those things would be to no longer be a Christian. You can't be a Christian if you don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead. But then things like, infant baptism or eternal security, or differing doctrines on predestination and things like that, we are free to disagree on. You can disagree on infant baptism and still be a Christian. You can disagree on eternal security and still be a Christian, as long as our basis, as long as our foundation is the same, that we are saved based on Christ's work and not our own, right? That we are saved by grace. And so when I go over the tulip stuff with you guys, there's a very good possibility that some of you, maybe even most of you, are going to disagree with me on a few points, and that's fine. We're more than welcome to disagree on some of these things, but I just want to make sure that we understand that even when we disagree, we're still brothers in Christ. It's not, if you disagree with me, it's not going to change my view or my opinion of you. I hope it doesn't change your view or your opinion of me. But just because we disagree, it doesn't mean we can't get along. And so I just wanted to put that out there before I get started on those videos, which I'm hoping to do in the next couple weeks. I'm hoping to maybe get started and maybe post a video about total depravity. We're just going to have to wait and see what happens. But thank you guys for listening. I hope you got something out of this. I hope it made some sort of sense. And I love you guys, and thanks for listening.